Evening, everyone. Bit of chit-chat in the room. It's right, now we're back live. Good evening. You're very welcome to this Tortoise Open News. My name's Ceri Thomas. I'm one of the editors and partners here. A lot of you will know the drill by now, which is this is our main editorial meeting of the week. We do think-ins day in and day out at Tortoise to inform our journalism, to help us sort of reach better informed points of views about the world. We bring in people from outside. We have people, journalists and members alongside each other in the newsroom here. And at the end of it all, we hope to come out having hoovered up lots of different points of view and perspectives and bits of knowledge from left, right and centre, smarter, wiser and better able to do our job. We do have this one rule that we talk about more than we enforce, which is that we don't want questions. We want to know what you think. We want to know what you know. And we don't want this to be a traditional sort of panel show. We want it to be a proper, big, open conversation. We've got two things we want to talk about tonight. One of them is Brexit and the stuff that's happened today. Quite an important speech, I think, in Lisbon by the Brexit Minister, Lord Frost. I actually want to come to that in a few minutes, because I want to start with the other thing that we know we're going to talk about, which is a campaign, by Paul, campaign to use the business voice to influence the debate about the death penalty in the United States. So it was launched by a campaign called the Responsible Business Initiative for Justice. We've got Ben Cumming and Lena Patel from that initiative here with us this evening. And I think if we can start with you, because it's not actually, I confess, it's not something I'd heard about until I knew you were coming this evening. So I'm interested for that reason alone. But also I think the idea that business, British business, American business can have an influence on the debate about the death penalty in the States, and I think from your perspective, wider questions of penal reform, criminal justice reform, the whole gamut of things. It might strike some people as a slightly sort of counterintuitive idea. So Lena, do you want to just, where did this thing come from in the first place?
So we launched the Business Leaders Against the Death Penalty campaign in March earlier this year at South by Southwest. And it came out of a drive from the campaign movement on the ground, actually, that there was this tipping point in the US where kind of everything was aligned. And we've been having lots of conversations with Virgin and Sir Richard Branson, who's been a real advocate about abolition for a long time. And everything aligned. We decided to put this campaign together in partnership with Virgin and Virgin Unite. And we launched at South by Southwest with Richard as our kind of as spearhead. And the idea is to get businesses to sign a declaration calling for the global abolition of the death penalty. And kind of fast forward a few months now, we did a second big announcement with World Day Against the Death Penalty, which just took place on Sunday. We have over 150 business leaders signed up to this campaign, people like Sheryl Sandberg from Facebook, Paul Polman, Arianna Huffington. But we've also reached out to sort of those smaller organisations, those smaller businesses, because businesses have a really important role to play in society. They have human rights, their consumers, their employees want this. And so this campaign kind of fell at the right time, I think, for us. And we launched, and it's going really well, very powerful. And we're working across the US. We want to work more globally. At the moment, our direction is currently the US.
Already, actually, Andrew Girdwood in the chat is saying the two topics, death penalty and Brexit, are not unrelated, because he had wished that business had been more active during the Brexit campaign. He wasn't alone in that, was he? So he's welcoming the fact that you're encouraging businesses to get stuck into this. But I guess, Ben, you are a long way from the very famous Milton Friedman quote, "The business of business is business," aren't you?
Yeah. And I think that is really, the transition away from that is reflected by this campaign. I mean, almost every evidence we're looking at right now is showing that the perceived responsibility of businesses to engage on issues of social justice and racial justice are more pronounced than ever. 6 in 10 Americans, for example, believe that businesses, it's not acceptable for them to stay silent about social justice issues. And 50% of them say that businesses that do stay silent don't care about those issues. And at a time when the events of the past 18 months have shown us that its broken justice system is the most glaring social issue facing an American generation, business engagement on it is becoming existential. And the death penalty in many ways embodies everything that is wrong with the US justice system in its cruelty, its waste, its ineffectiveness, its expense, and its racism.
I mean, it's easy to say something in a poll, isn't it? But I'm not sure I care, when I buy my shoes, whether that company is for... I probably care about how the shoes are made. Mm-hmm. So I might care about whether they're made in some grotty place in, Bangladesh or Vietnam. But I'm honestly not sure I care what that company thinks about death penalty. So are you convinced that polling is kind of hard enough for you to work with?
I'm convinced that it's hard enough to work with, and I'm also convinced that the drive doesn't just come from consumers as well. Employees have been shown to have a massive role in this, and at a time when I won't bag on about polling too much, I promise, but we do see numbers that show that people seriously take into account the external voice of businesses and their leaders on issues like racial justice and social justice when deciding where to work, and at a time when more than ever companies are competing for top talent. It's important that they recognize.
Yeah, actually, I can probably see it more easily from the employee perspective than I can. So tell me then, Lena, how do you run this campaign? Because we were talking actually before we started this about California, so a state which still has the death penalty, where incarceration rates are huge. There are, I forget how many people are locked up in California, but it's absolutely enormous. How would an organisation like yours intervene in a state like that to try to get the outcomes that you're looking for?
Yeah, so we join campaigns at their tipping points. So we are directed by the campaign movement on the ground that are working in states across the US, because they do all the groundwork, they do all sort of that kind of on-the-ground work, and then they will say to us, right now, it'd be great to have a business voice just to get this bill over the line. And so currently in the US, 2 states that we're currently kind of actively working in are Ohio and Utah, where we know that the death penalty possibly might come up, where the bill might come up. It's 2 Republican governors. So if that happens, that's going to be incredible. Virginia just abolished the death penalty. It's one of the bloodiest states in terms of death on the death penalty in the US. And so we kind of join those campaigns at that tipping point, and we'll bring business voices to the table, either through private advocacy, through public advocacy, to help get that bill over the line. And that's the point that we join. So we kind of want to go where the bill is just about to sort of make it to the line.
Yeah, but if I was talking to Phoebe, my colleague Phoebe there, I don't know if we can get a microphone to Phoebe, because one of the things that Phoebe's been working on is the proposed change in the abortion law in Texas. And Phoebe, because one of the things you've been tracking is how businesses have responded to that proposed law change. What have you seen there?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because I see the argument, these business voices have come behind it. Salesforce was a great example. They turned around and said that they'd fund people, women in Texas, to move out of state. You also saw other tech companies, Bumble, for example, which is very women-led. They kind of used it as a social justice issue. Netflix did. Uber and Lyft said they paid the legal fees for drivers. So there was a kind of a big kind of movement around these cases. But what I'd also say is, there's other reasons why Texas might be interesting specifically, is that there is people moving out of California to Texas because it's cheaper. It's easier for them to get tax rebates. So for example, Elon Musk, we've had lots of chats about Elon Musk today. He's decided to move the headquarters of Tesla to Austin. And part of that is the fact that there is shorter commutes. He's had issues in San Francisco and kind of having to deal with that. And the governor in Texas said that he'd had conversations with Elon Musk about the Texas abortion law. And Elon Musk, of course, went to Twitter to talk about it and said, I don't get involved in politics. But it seemed like he was getting very involved in politics, and people kind of threw complaints about it. So I guess there's 2 sides of it, that if a business leader says, I'm moving my whole operation to a state despite this, then it can work in like both angles. But it's going to be interesting to see what plays out, especially if other states decide to change their laws on abortion, especially.
Yeah, and Ben, you're not talking to businesses about moving out of states with the death penalty to states that don't have it, or Is that part of your sort of plan?
I mean, I would say that we want businesses to use every piece of leverage and every part of their platform and voice in order to try and deliver change on this issue. And I think that, actually we will start to see that a lot more. I mean, just a couple of days ago, Mike Novogratz, who's a very big name investor in the US, he's the CEO and founder of a company called Galaxy Digital, said in an op-ed on MarketWatch, said, investors should vote with their feet if their governments are continue to acting so irresponsibly on this issue, if they're continuing to spend our taxes so poorly on something that doesn't work and is ultimately immoral. So I think, we will see businesses engaging in a bigger way. But I think that more importantly, it's critical to note that businesses do have the power to create change beyond just threatening local legislatures. I mean, no constituent is more important to lawmakers, especially at a state level, than major employers and investors. So when they speak up and make their preferences known, lawmakers listen. And I think that by speaking out on this issue, they do exactly that.
Yeah. I'm going to, if I can, if he's there, bring Gregory Mulligan, who's just been asking in the chat about, making a point about the US banks. But while we're seeing if Gregory is around, Giles, you used to work in the States for the Times, did you, I think? Yeah. Yeah? Did business seem like a natural part, or would it seem like a natural part of the coalition against the advocacy coalition against the death penalty to you?
Well, it didn't then. I mean, this is the 90s, and then again, 2009 to 11. Oddly, I went twice to Utah to witness firing squad executions. And I have to say, if there is a chance of the Utah State Assembly suspending the death penalty, that is extraordinary. Mm-hmm. I mean, are you saying there is?
Yeah.
Well, that probably tells us a lot about how Utah is changing, not least as a result of arrivals from California. But of course, as you know better than I do, the erosion of the sort of consensus behind the death penalty started with an Illinois moratorium, right? Mm-hmm. Which itself was in large part the result of work by academics and students at Northwestern and the Innocence Project, and it sort of went out from there. So I see and am quite astonished by business involvement that you are behind now. But I do notice, looking at the signatures, correct me if I'm wrong, that we've got we've got Ben and Jerry's, we've got Sally Jewell, former Secretary of State of the Interior, Ariana Huffington, Sheryl Sandberg, and some former S&P 500 CEOs among the 150 signatories. Are there many serving current big name US CEOs on your list of signatories? That would be a really significant indicator, wouldn't it?
Well, you can.
Yeah, I mean, Mark Benioff from Salesforce is the current CEO. We have, putting me on the spot now because I'm trying to remember all the names.
Or people like Mike Novogratz, who we just mentioned. Is
right.
Yeah. And also on a more local level, people like Jared Smith, who's the CEO of Qualtrics, which is an enormous company in Utah, and is indeed at the vanguard of the sort of Utah tech insurgency. So no, there are definitely big names on there. And also not just companies that are US based, but also companies that are international but have very substantial operations in the United States. So Werner Baumann, for example, who's the CEO of Bayer, currently is very involved. Obviously Richard Branson, Virgin has substantial operations in the US. So it's the list does go on.
But how big is the current Republican majority in the Utah State Assembly?
Oh, that's a good question.
Because that is the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't see. But I mean,
all right, Phoebe's going to go on Google and find that out for us now.
Yeah, thank you.
But also it's not, one of the things that we point to, especially in states like Utah, is it's not, Republicans aren't just unilaterally for the death penalty.
Right.
Like, because of the tireless work of campaigners on the ground, you mentioned organizations like the Innocence Project, also Witness to Innocence, Eighth Amendment Project, the growing conservative movement to end the death penalty is palpable. I mean, and that's the reason why states like Utah are on the table, is because conservatives are on board, because of the morality of the issue, but also just the sheer ineffectiveness of it as a justice measure. When you come around to the fact that it's incredibly expensive and it doesn't work, even the most tough on crime advocates have to sort of look at it harder. And we are witnessing a truly bipartisan movement to end it.
Okay.
And I don't think you can take away what's happened in the last 18 months. If we're going to talk about racial justice, you have to talk about the death penalty. You have to talk about criminal justice. And I just think that's also put a glaring spotlight on this issue, on this awful form of punishment that, you just can't separate the two. And so I think that's also had an impact.
Right.
I would say, just quickly on the Republican point, I mean, Ayanna Pressley's federal death penalty abolition bill has recently announced, Republican co-signers to it. So, we are witnessing slowly but surely that erosion of conservative support for capital punishment.
All right. Well, Giles, maybe we keep an eye on Utah. It's obviously caught your interest. Phoebe's got the answer to the question.
23 Republicans to 6 Democrats in the Senate and Utah.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll see whether actually if the Conservative tide is on the turn, then that would be even more interesting, wouldn't it?
Learn something every day, I'm thinking.
Okay. We might come back to you at the end if you don't mind sticking around, because we do want to talk about Brexit a bit. We've got Jill Rutter here with us, who's a senior research fellow at UK and Changing Europe, and I think out there in the ether is Matthew O'Toole, who is a member of the Legislative Assembly for South Belfast, Matthew Dancona as well, and love to hear what you think about Brexit, which has suddenly come back onto our horizons in a way I think that many of us weren't hoping for or expecting particularly. But so we're between two big important moments. This afternoon in Lisbon, the Brexit Minister, Lord Frost, made what had been billed certainly as quite a significant speech, setting out UK's position on Brexit, particularly in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol. And then tomorrow we've got the EU's response to that. Matt Dancona, can I come to you first? Because I know that you were sort of keeping tabs on what Lord Frost was saying in Lisbon this afternoon. What was your readout on it?
Well, it was it was the full Monty, wasn't it? I mean, the last thing I want to inflict on any thinking is a sort of a full the story so far on this, because that would take us into tomorrow morning. But in a way, you don't need it, because what you've got here is one of Boris Johnson's most trusted and most abrasive allies, someone who was his Europe advisor at the Foreign Office, and was also very much one of the gang, the vote. He wasn't part of the Vote Leave campaign, but he was very much part of the Vote Leave gang. Cummings, Dominic Cummings, Lee Kane, Oliver Lewis, and so on. He's a clever ex-diplomat, Frost, but he's very, very tough. And his style in negotiations is really that of a bruiser. So, and what we saw today was pure pugilism. I mean, it wasn't diplomacy. And a sort of ironic way of giving a flavour of what he was saying was he quoted Edmund Burke in an effort to look learned, and he said politics should be adjusted not to human reasonings, but to human nature. Not to human reasonings, but to human nature, which is obviously his way of saying, I don't care what the rationality of the situation is. We're not going with it. We're going with whatever we define as human nature. And the problem here is that the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was the very delicately geared arrangement reached between Boris Johnson and the former Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar in 2019 to deal with the obvious problem that Ireland is a very delicately balanced part of what was the British membership of the EU, because the Republic of Ireland is still part of the EU, and the Good Friday Agreement requires frictionless borders between the North and the South. And how do you sort that one? Very, very difficult. And the Northern Ireland Protocol was a way of getting around it, which replaced, if people can think way back, the long dreaded, and let's not get into it, backstop answer and basically, to cut a long story short, put a border of sorts between Northern Ireland, which in many respects remains part of the EU, at least single market, and across the Irish Sea and you're on mainland Britain, and it's normal Brexit applies. And not surprisingly, it's been a bumpy ride. And what Frost said today was basically, we don't want any of it. We're not going to have the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. We don't want customs checks. And crucially, he's ready to trigger Article 16, which to decode just means we're not going along with anything in the protocol at all, which then opens the possibility of a full-blown trade war with the EU. Now, the wiseacres of Westminster are tonight all saying, this is all very clever because this is the way he works. He comes out storming, and then the Brussels folds. Maybe there'll be a big compromise. I think the EU's Brexit leader, Markus Sefcovic, is not a pushover, and so I wouldn't expect the EU to say, "Oh goodness, we better act now that Lord Frost has said all this." I don't think it'll be as straightforward as that.
Yeah.
And sorry, Gary.
There was one question. So I listened to Lord Frost on YouTube on 1.5 speed, which made him sound a bit more cheerful, I thought, than he was at normal speed. But he went out of his way at one point to say there's no political dividend for the Prime Minister in banging on about this. He pointed to the fact that he hadn't mentioned it hardly at all in his speech at the Tory Party conference last week. So what's your readout on the timing? Because this is a choice.
My readout, Kerry, is that's a lie. Because what I think this is designed to do, you see, one of the things you must always do with the Boris Johnson government is chuck all the old political rules out of the window. The normal way of approaching this would be to think, it's just diplomacy, there'll be a nice solution, it'll be all right on the night. We know from all sorts of sources, not least Cummings himself, there's part of Boris Johnson that likes chaos. And we also know from Boris Johnson, going back a long way, that what he really likes is to have someone to blame. And although, of course, no government in the middle of an energy, fuel and food crisis wants major disruption in Northern Ireland and in the supply of goods to and fro between Northern Ireland and the mainland, it is a mistake to think that it will frighten the Johnson government to be at war with Europe. Quite the opposite. This is just what it wants. Not long Brexit as opposed to long COVID. We all think, oh my God, not more Brexit. Actually, this is catnip to the Johnson government because it reminds his base of why they voted for him. You'll notice throughout the conference, the thing he kept saying is, I won't go back to mass immigration. Now, not a single interviewer asked him about that, but he wasn't talking to the interviewers. He was reminding the Brexit base, I won't let you down. And so whilst I'm not suggesting that the ideal outcome of this is that we go to trade war with the EU, I am suggesting that people be very wary about thinking we definitely won't, because
there's still I can see the political logic that says we've got these lovely political dividing lines in this country. It's quite important that we repaint them occasionally to keep them nice and bright. But it's still, the risks on this one, it's still a big calculation, because if it does end badly, if it does end in a proper full-blown trade dispute, then that's a significant problem, isn't it?
Massive. And one of the things that's been consistently mind-bending about this Prime Minister, and before that when he was Foreign Secretary, is how little he really seems to understand or care about the subtlety, sophistication, and deep emotional significance of the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, to say he is playing with fire is an underestimation, but nonetheless, he is. And it's so important to underestimate his readiness to do so. That's what I'm really trying to get across, which is that there is especially in the centre of London, in what Cummings calls SW1, in the sensible places, there is always a tendency to see rationality where there is none. And all I'm counselling is never forget this is Boris Johnson we're talking about. That's all. So I hope we don't go into trade war with the EU. Probably we won't. Probably someone will come up with a solution. But don't assume that this is all part of some cunning chess strategy.
Okay, Matt, brilliant. We'll come back to you. Let me go to Matthew O'Toole. Matthew, thanks so much for joining us. You've done some great things with Tortoise in the past. So Matthew, you were a civil servant in London, went back to Northern Ireland to become a MLA for the SDLP in South Belfast. I think, is that right?
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. So
can I use you? We can hear you perfectly. Thank you. Can I use you as a bit of a reporter to start with? Because we saw sort of, you were kind of early adopters of empty shelves and supply chain problems and all that kind of stuff that we've now caught up with you on. But what's the sort of level of friction? What's the level of problems that the trading arrangements between the British mainland and Northern Ireland is causing at the moment?
I'm glad you asked, because it's really important to set out some parameters and some, I guess, facts, or at least my reporting of it. Obviously, I'm a politician, so feel free to apply your own disclaimer to that. I'm not neutral on the question of either Brexit or the protocol, but I'll endeavour to give you a fairly honest view of it. I think it's really important to start by saying that one of the great constructions that certain parties in Northern Ireland, the DUP particularly, but also laterally the UK government, when the UK government decided that it was going to take the approach of trying to either completely overhaul or abandon the protocol, there's been a desire to single out the protocol as a sort of sui generis thing that is totally separate from Brexit itself, as if it was invented purely for the purposes of having certain regulations differing in Northern Ireland than in GB in Britain. In terms of what happened at the beginning of this year, there was disruption to supply chains, and there has been disruption as a result of the fact that companies, whether they're retailers or any other business, and in some cases individuals, but it's mostly been focused on businesses, have had new bureaucracy, form filling and burdens as they bring goods in from Britain into Northern Ireland, because, as Matt D'Ancona said, Northern Ireland is effectively in the single market for goods. It's important to say that it's only in the single market for goods. There are a couple of other specific directives that apply to it, because we have, for example, one electricity market on the island of Ireland, but beyond that, it's essentially we're in the single market for goods. We don't free movement of people or capital does not apply to us. It's only goods. And there was a bit of disruption at the beginning of this year. Obviously, some of that was connected to COVID issues. Lots of the issues around familiarization have bedded in and been dealt with. There are certain areas where we still have grace periods that have either been agreed by the UK and EU, or they've been unilaterally extended by the UK. So some of those changes have been they're not particularly marked. But I think it's really important to say, and I can't say this more bluntly, more directly, it sometimes appears from reporting in London, as someone who lived in London for a long time and now lives in Belfast, some of the reporting or some of the depiction of what's happened in Northern Ireland is that we're drinking rainwater from tin cans and we've been disrupted by the protocol. That is totally and utterly false. There have been discrete disruptions that some of which have been dealt with businesses through familiarization, and there are areas where the UK and EU do need, hopefully, to agree smoother processes in terms of operating the protocol. But the idea that Northern Ireland is disproportionately affected is not only untrue. In a sense, we are protected from some of the consequences that are happening in Britain. There was no fuel supply crisis in Northern Ireland, and there hasn't been any shortage on the supermarket shelves really since the beginning of the year. And in part, that's because we are part of the EU supply chain. Up to a point, we can move goods seamlessly in from the rest of Ireland, from the Republic of Ireland, and now we can also, by the way, export seamlessly into Britain. It's just there are some new barriers in terms of moving goods in. So,
so Matt, let me ask you, because can I sort of time shift you back to your old role as a civil servant? So if the government needs, in order to trigger Article 16, the UK government has to claim that there are serious, I think it's economic, social or environmental consequences of the current arrangement in order to trigger Article 16. If I parachute you back in as a civil servant and say, how do you make that case as the UK government? How are you going to make it?
Well, I mean, I'm sort of loath to make a case that I profoundly oppose now. I think the point I would make on that is that there is the trade distortion and disruption. I mean, first of all, I think it may well end up being tested in arbitration what that phrase actually means. Clearly, when the UK decided to leave the single market for goods in the customs union and agreed to specific arrangements for Northern Ireland, which involved Northern Ireland remaining in the single market for goods in the customs union, ergo that, and therefore a jurisdictional threshold in the Irish Sea, it accepted that there would be some form of diversion or goods. So I think the post hoc argument the UK government is making now around that being justification for triggering Article 16 is very problematic. It's also really important to say that from, well, not just my perspective, from the perspective of businesses here, first of all, no businesses here want Article 16 to be triggered. The Article 16 discourse is one that is largely to satisfy an as yet unquantified level of unionist discontent, it has to be said. The idea that the entirety of the unionist community in Northern Ireland is out on the streets and furious about the protocol is, I'm afraid, a contention that requires unpacking. Most unionists are certainly not crazy about the protocol. I wouldn't claim that they are. I think there is a wide range of opinion on it, ranging from deep animosity through to frustration, through to inconvenience, through to kind of a sanguine attitude and a desire to simply make it work and move on. But it is claimed by some of the more extreme and occasionally unlawful actors that there's mass unrest on the streets. Well, every time they try and have mass protests on the streets about the protocol, a few hundred people show up. And so the idea, and David Frost keeps peddling this idea on the media, and it keeps getting trotted out by people, and it keeps getting regurgitated, and he uses it in his lines to take when he engages with the EU institutions, that there's mass societal unrest in Northern Ireland. Well, I mean, I could look out my window now and it isn't there. And every time they've tried to have a rally, a few hundred people, sometimes people, masked men, and I don't mean masked because they're wearing COVID masks, I mean other types of masks, rock up. If you know the history of Northern Ireland, I'm sure many people in this call do, if you go back to the mid-1990s or the Anglo-Irish Agreement protests or the protests over the Sunningdale Agreement, when unionism was properly annoyed and they wanted to get tens or even hundreds of thousands of people out onto the streets of Belfast and Northern Ireland, my God, they can do it. They could do it. I'm afraid that hasn't happened this time. There is a real desire to smooth the disruption of moving goods from Britain into Northern Ireland. There's no doubt about that. But I'm afraid the assertion that people are, vehement that there's mass-wide disruption and they want Article 16 to be triggered and a trade war to be started over the protocol rather than simply concessions and agreement on making it work. I'm afraid that is a very problematic assertion by Frost.
Because he builds on that, doesn't he? And let me just say, by the way, that if I realise this is complicated and not kind of home territory for a lot of us, so let me kind of unilaterally suspend the rule that we don't allow questions. If you want to ask a question of Matt or of Jill, who I'll come to in a second on this, then by all means do that, and we'll come to you as soon as we can. But Matt, just to come back to you, the core argument, it seems to me, that David Frost was making today is that we're doing this not because it might not in the knowledge that it might imperil the Good Friday Agreement, but actually we're doing it to save the Good Friday Agreement because the current arrangements are placing that agreement in such jeopardy. That's the heart of the new argument, isn't it? I think we've lost Matthew.
Oh, sorry. This is. I thought you were going to Matt Dancona there. Apologies. I can't answer that question. That's the joys of having two people remotely with the same name. I think the answer to that question is, that is the argument that he made today. One thing I would point out is in a speech that was full of references to, he brought in Edmund Burke. He didn't mention, of course, Edmund Burke is an Irishman. He's the British philosopher that people decline to point out his Irishness. The great British conservative philosopher Edmund Burke. There was a long disquisition on on, British diplomacy, British-Portuguese relations. Everyone got dragged in, from the Treaty of Windsor in 1386 to Princess Isabella and Van Eyck the painter. There was precious little actual analysis of what the Good Friday Agreement is. He sort of said it's about balance. What does that mean? And this is an argument that's repeatedly made about East-West has been disrupted. Well, it has, in the sense that the movement of goods into Northern Ireland has been disrupted. But the High Court in Belfast found recently, it was very clear that the constitutional position of Northern Ireland has not changed. We're still in the United Kingdom. And so the repeated assertions about the Good Friday Agreement are, I'm afraid, just that. And if Frost was today asking people to make a judgment on a finely argued speech, well, the bits about the Good Friday Agreement were in no way finely argued, because it was sort of a sub-GCSE. It was just sort of, the Good Friday Agreement's this thing that's about balance, and we're trying to protect it. There was no real detailed analysis. But what it is a very finely constructed constitutional document, which I'm afraid is in direct contradiction to the Brexit project. And that's why it keeps becoming so such a problem, because it contradicts so many sovereigntist ideas that are clearly dear to David Frost. But it's very, very difficult to reconcile that extremely subtle, clever document, which makes Northern Ireland dual, keeps it in the United Kingdom by consent, but with a unique relationship with the Republic, the rest of Ireland, swathed in multilateralism and dual identity. It is very, very subtle and complex. It is nothing like David Frost's view of sovereignty. The rest of the speech, by the way, was a sort of pay into British nationalism. You wouldn't know this. The UK is a multinational state. So I'm afraid I'm happy to engage with in a debate about the complexity of the Good Friday Agreement and how it relates to the protocol and Brexit. But I'm afraid, based on today's remarks, David Frost is the last person to have a plausible account of that. I think it was totally instrumental. His view of Northern Ireland, indeed his view of British-Irish relations, are very, very instrumental. He's a sort of, there's a little bit, frankly, with David Frost of the Baron Munchausen. He's kind of a trumped up peer baron who kind of beating his chest and placing himself in the centre of European intrigue. The actual reality of Northern Ireland, and indeed Irish history and British Irish history, is something that he doesn't have time for and isn't going to bother to engage with in any real detail.
Great. Okay. So I'll call you Matthew from now, and I'll call Matt Dancona Matt, but I'm going to come to Jill in the meantime. Jill, because I'm conscious we did try to get some true believers in Brexit on the call. We tried any number of Conservative MPs, and we couldn't find anybody who were free this evening. But so I do want to test some of the arguments that they would make about the ECJ. So I think the EU's assumption about the British government saying that the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, can't have jurisdiction over Northern Ireland is that it's a deliberate creation of a red line, because the British government knows that the EU can't compromise on that. Is that the Brexiteer position, is that the EU could compromise? Could they compromise on the role of the ECJ?
So where I think they won't compromise, I mean, could is a different word, where they won't compromise is that the ultimate arbiter of what EU law means is going to be the European Court of Justice. And why do we think that they won't move on that? Because when I think, this is before my time, we need sort of proper EU lawyers here, but when the original version of the EEA agreement, that's the agreement that the EU has with Norway, Liechtenstein and Iceland to be part of the single market, but not EU members, did propose moving some rights of the interpretation of EU law away from the ECJ. The ECJ struck that down and said, you've got to think again. So they won't accept that. But what I think, there was a very interesting word that David Frost used in his speech, which was ultimately, when he was talking about the ECJ, if I could find it, but I can't obviously, because it's so densely written in the printout I've got, and has to make room for a very big picture of David Frost as well. So he said, ultimately, it can't be decided by the ECJ. So what the EU does have in some arrangements, I think it has this in Ukraine, and this is dredging back to when we were looking at what might dispute resolution mean, is that you have an arbitration procedure where you have an argument. That arbitration panel can say, oops, we need to know what this EU law means. That goes to the ECJ. The ECJ says, this is what EU law means. Right. They pop that back to the arbitration panel. Then the arbitration panel finally resolves the dispute. I think that's what the EU was looking for in its institutional framework with Switzerland, where they have a big issue over the agreements they have with Switzerland because there is no proper jurisdiction there, and that's been a thing. So I think that if you were looking for where might you agree, I don't know whether Matt or Matthew agree, but I think if you were saying where might you end up, you might end up with something where you said, we acknowledge this bit of the role of the ECJ, the final decision will go to a dispute resolution mechanism, but it will recognise the fact that only the European Court of Justice interprets EU law, which is really what the EU's red line is.
And there's precedent there, so that might be comforting.
I think there's a bit of precedent. There is precedent there. I mean, what the EU, I think, will say, what was very notable at David Frost's speech, I'm coming out of my role as Brexiteer on the panel here. What I think the EU would say, looking at this speech, is there was a remarkable amount of the passive in the speech, that things were agreed, which just seemed to be happening to the UK government and to David Frost without us seeming to have any agency in it. And I think that was rather weird. You know, it's like a self-signing agreement that suddenly emerged. And of course, our hands were tied by the evil double act of Hilary Benn and Alistair Burt. So, you know, what on earth could we do but then sign these surrender terms? So in some ways, David Frost's speech was actually a longer version of the speech that he gave to that slightly empty hall in Manchester last week. He just sort of, you know, had a bit more time to talk about Edmund Burke and things like that, because he only had 10 minutes on the stage in Manchester.
And just to, I said we were between these two big moments of the Frost speech today and the EU's measures tomorrow. What are we? There has been some trailing of what we think the EU is going to, how it's going to move. So what do we think the likely EU offer will amount to?
Well, I think if we move away from the Frost speech today, let's put David Frost there, and it's quite interesting, why did he decide to make this speech today? The real action was in the command paper that David Frost put out in July, which said where the UK wanted improvements. We're told that he's tabled a legal text this evening, which is his rewrite of the protocol, but all my colleagues who've been looking for it in the nightmare that is .gov.uk can't yet find it, but .gov.uk is such a nightmare if you want to find any documents about what the government's doing. It might be there, it's just nobody's found it yet. But he seems to have handed a new text over setting out the UK's demands. So the UK was asking for various sort of alleviations. As Matt O'Toole was saying, there are various things where the UK has first agreed grace periods and then unilaterally extended those grace periods. So it wants arrangements allowing medicines authorised by UK regulators to move over without a problem into Northern Ireland. It's looking for things like, you know, easing pet transport. It's looking for goods that, the famous sausages and things like that, so chilled meats, that you're not allowed as a third country to export into the EU and the UK, or Great Britain, more accurately, as a third country. So those aren't supposed to be moving into Northern Ireland. So that's your famous sausage wall things. So what we assume is that the EU is coming forward with a set of specific proposals to address those concerns. They may not go as far as David Frost wants, but what both sides say is that they will then intensively negotiate. What we seem to have had sort of last week in Manchester, today in Lisbon, is the elevation of this point about the European Court of Justice, which does look to quite a lot of people. So, yeah, you could almost characterise it. Is it that the UK government is looking and thinking, oh my God, they're producing a package that is near enough that we might have to agree it? Damn, because you've still got the Ulster Union, the Democratic Unionists rampaging around. Very interested in what Matt O'Toole thinks. we need to find something more that they can't possibly agree, because otherwise we risk having to agree this with them. But that might be far too cynical. It might be that, you know, they do see this genuinely. We've seen various people saying they embrace these madman negotiating tactics that in order to get people to move forward and create more space for movement, you have to be asking for something more extreme, and then they will move towards it. Oh, and it's possible that David Frost could say, well, look, my tactics have got the EU moving on a lot of issues that back in March and April, they weren't going to move on. So actually, my tactics are working. And the government has, I think, persuaded itself that its tactics are quite successful, and that really the only language that the EU understands is this doing that. I mean, and David Frost was quite interesting in his speech today, because he had a litany of other complaints about the EU as well, and how they were being unreasonable in the way in which they were inflicting pain on the UK. And he had this line in it, which is being interpreted as a dig, particularly at President Macron, that there was some in the EU who were desperate to see Brexit not succeed. So it's sort of quite a long list of complaints.
And Jill, if we take the sort of ECJ dead cat as something that's intended to shift the EU in its negotiations.
Well, we don't know. We honestly don't know.
But if we take it as that, can you look back at earlier stages of the negotiation and say that kind of hardline chest beating thing David Frost did work, or is that just fanciful on his part and Boris Johnson's?
I mean, I'm thinking, but very interested in what Matt O'Toole thinks.
Stand by, Matt, we're coming. Yeah.
Sorry, Matt. I do think that there were areas in the protocol which, one of the lines that David Frost had was that, we negotiated this bit of time ago when we didn't even know that there was going to be a trade and cooperation agreement, blah, 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 stuff like that. Now, there's some areas where he is right, actually. You might want to look again at the protocol, because things were agreed in the trade and cooperation agreement. And one of the things people point to was there are provisions on state aid subsidies, which have the potential to affect subsidy rules, whatever. But actually, there's provisions on what sort of state aid regime the UK will have in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So that's called Article 10. You probably don't need that in that form anymore. You might want to confine it much more. So I think there's some areas there. The bit that you didn't know at the time that they agreed the protocol was, I think, quite how hard a Brexit the UK government was going to end up negotiating. And a lot of the problems are that the UK has negotiated such a hard border with the rest of the EU in order to have sovereignty, the right to diverge and things like that. That has, because of the protocol, imposed an incredibly hard border down the Irish Sea. If the UK in that agreement had signed up to, what we call a Swiss-style veterinary agreement or something like that, where we'd agreed to align on sanitary and phytosanitary standards, so farm welfare standards, things like that, product standards for agriculture, then you wouldn't have needed a lot of the stuff that's come in. And I think where the UK does have a point is that the sort of border that is appropriate for two really quite distant trading partners, and that is now Great Britain and the EU on goods, UK and the EU on services, for two quite distant trading partners, is an incredibly inappropriate border for an integrated national economy. And that is why you are seeing the things Matt O'Toole was talking about, the sort of trade reorientation north-south. Now, that is what David Frost will say is trade disruption and may justify triggering Article 16, but is in a sense a necessary consequence of the sort of Brexit he went for. But you could have imagined a different sort of negotiation, that trade and cooperation agreement, which would have ended up with that border in the Irish Sea being quite a lot softer. But I do think there are some issues to be looked at, and some of the things where I think the EU is moving. The really interesting question is whether in February this was the responsibility of Michael Gove. Michael Gove actually had quite a good relationship, as far as we could see, with Maros Sefcovic, but he was moved. And I remember some Irish diplomats saying there was a meeting which they had, it was the last meeting Michael Gove had with sort of EU diplomats briefing them on what was going on. And Michael Gove, was being quite positive, it's relatively sort of chummy with Šefčovič. But then David Frost intervened. He was present at the meeting as well from the number 10 Europe unit. And suddenly, Frost by name, Frost in the meeting, because he was taking a much harder line than Michael Gove. So I think Michael Gove might have got to where we're about to get to eventually, if we decide we're going to agree this package at some point, but in a much less sort of dramatic sort of way, much less brinkmanship, much less aggression and competition, and much less collateral damage to UK-EU relations.
Yeah.
Discuss.
Before I come back to Matt O'Toole, Sam Houston, you were talking in the chat about what you thought the political motivation was behind this. If you're there, Sam, let me see if I can bring you in. No, we've lost Sam. Okay, we'll have to stick with the Matts then. Matt O'Toole, Jill, I think, raised a number of points there that she was interested in your response to, but maybe start with the ECJ point. Do you think the raising of the spectre of the ECJ is a tactic to drive a better deal, or is it a tactic to ensure that there won't be a deal?
The short answer is I don't know, and I think that's either the scary thing, or if you're that way inclined, the genius of the kind of madman theory negotiating approach. The ECJ thing, I mean, it's really important to try and disaggregate the things which. So if you were to start the year, as in on January 1st or the first week in January, and you were to draw up a list, or even late last year, draw up a list of the potential, the practical and more theoretical, or I guess constitutional, although it's not as has been repeatedly said by courts, the protocol is not in and of itself constitutional, but it has a constitutional symbolism for some people. But if you were to draw up at the start of the year a list of concessions, changes, mitigations, then I think that would have been designed not just to make the protocol smoother, but to allay the political fears, particularly among unionists. And the truth is, you're never going to allay all it's worth saying in parenthesis, the nature of Northern Ireland society is when something like this happens, you're never going to allay the fears of everyone. The idea that you can have dual consent for everything is, I'm afraid, wrong. I mean, there isn't dual consent for our current constitutional setup. There wasn't dual consent, of course, for Brexit. The majority here voted against it, and on it goes. David Frost talks about the need to have to rebuild the consent of one community. But if you were to trigger Article 16, by definition, that would not have the consent of Remain voters in large part, or the non-unionist community in Northern Ireland. And there is no, as it were, constitutional majority in Northern Ireland anymore. But that's all in parenthesis. On the point about the ECJ, why I referred back to the beginning of the year is that the ECJ having jurisdiction, as it's called, or ECJ judgments having effect on Northern Ireland businesses to the extent that they engage with the protocol, and Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland institutions, that really has never been a major part of the discussion here. It hasn't. I mean, there are some. I mean, it has, and I suppose in the sense that it's one of the outworkings of the principle of the protocol. So people who are the most implacably opposed to the principle, by implication, they don't like it. But the ECJ as a thing, and as a kind of, in the way that the ECJ is a thing for Bill Cash or Peter Lilly, is not a thing for the average shopper in Northern Ireland, or even the average unionist in Northern Ireland. So I don't know why it's been elevated in the last week or two. Jill's explanation that you need another potential thing to argue about if the EU are going to come up with a package of concessions that are as substantial tomorrow as we think they're going to be. And I should just say quickly as well, part of the challenge with the politics of all this and the way the UK is so confrontational is that you end up making people like me sound like we think the protocol is totally perfect, and you don't want it to be you don't want it to be touched at all. That's not true. It's never been true. What we have wanted to see is the protocol, because the protocol is sort of symbiotically connected to UK government choices, the harder the UK government rhetoric and the harder the Brexit for the UK government rhetoric, the more you're going to have, I guess, politicians like me, but also people who are worried and anxious about UK government intentions, and what that might mean for the island of Ireland. And Northern Ireland, you're going to cling on ever more furiously to the protocol and say, we need this thing to be implemented, because what happened in January when the EU made a massive misstep, a really, really big misstep, when they nearly triggered Article 16 themselves, is the first thing that happened was people like my party, the Alliance Party, even Sinn Féin, the Irish government, even to criticise the Commission. That Frost and others in the UK government dined out on that for months. It was used as evidence that the protocol had lost all confidence. The fact that even Sinn Féin, the SDLP, the Alliance Party, had deigned to criticise the EU on this one particular significant error they'd made. So the divisiveness, the partisanship of the UK approach has led to the situation where we all become partisans, even when our own position is more nuanced than that. And the last point I would make, I think is really critical, because it's sometimes, well, it's very often totally lost, is that it's often stated that the only thing that's been disrupted by Brexit and the protocol is what's called the East-West relationship, i.e. Northern Ireland's participation in the whole of the UK internal market. And it has, to the extent that the protocol has disrupted the way goods move in from Britain. But it's also really important to point out that since 80% is quite an important number here. First of all, 80% of the checks that are happening at the so-called Irish Sea border are SPS checks. You couldn't have an SPS border on the island of Ireland. So if there was a Swiss-style veterinary agreement, that would remove 80% of the checks overnight. No, even the hardest Brexiteer doesn't think you could impose a border in plant and animal standards on the island of Ireland. But the other 80% number that's really critical is the fact that most developed economies are about 80% services, including both the UK and the Republic of Ireland. And when 80% of your economy isn't trade in goods, it's services, that means that there's a range of disruptions north-south now. For example, we've lost the cross-border healthcare directive, which has caused complications on how people access reciprocal healthcare on either side of the border. So the all financial service has been disrupted. I could go on and on. A huge range of societal, community, economic activity has been disrupted because Northern Ireland is not in the single market other than for goods. And it's really important to bear that in mind. So there are huge north-south disruptions. They're just not as visible as the checking of goods. And that's the whole point of the protocol in the first place, because having a goods border, i.e. having a customs barrier and a regulatory threshold, would have been the most disruptive of all. But we have got loads of disruption on the land border, I'm afraid. It's just not as immediately visible as goods.
Matt, let me jump in there, because I want to ask you one more question. I've got Giles who wants to ask a question. I want to pick up with you, Matthew O'Toole, on something that Jill raised as well, which is the sort of political dynamic. So I think one of the arguments that's being made by the DUP is that you could, the Northern Ireland Protocol as is, could fracture the loyalist vote in Northern Ireland. You could end up, therefore, allowing a path to government for Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland. You could have a Sinn Féin government in the south. And Boris Johnson, you don't want that, do you? Is there any plausibility in that scenario? Is that the position of the DUP?
I think that's, well, it's important to point out that, my party competes for votes with Sinn Féin. I want to get as many votes off them as I possibly can. I'd rather Sinn Féin, I'd rather more people are voting for us, not Sinn Féin. But it's of course important that I issue a disclaimer, whatever you feel about Sinn Féin and indeed, their attitude to the past here and their culpability in many ways for some of the worst things that happened over the last 3 or 4 decades. They are they're a democratic party who are entitled to be, they are in government. They're the joint heads of government with the DUP. Sometimes both the DUP and Sinn Féin are very keen to downplay their own power and responsibility in Northern Ireland, but they've been running this place for the last 14 years. But it's also, it is worth saying that part of the context here is, and part of the reason why the protocol is such a challenge is that it's now not just about how you move goods into Northern Ireland and avoid a goods border on the island of Ireland. Because the Good Friday Agreement in itself was such a complicated, subtle piece of statecraft, which changed the UK constitution quite fundamentally. And that's the thing that lots of the UK political class, that particularly on the right, has really struggled with, is the huge kind of the consequential nature of the Good Friday Agreement as a constitutional document. But also within that, within that settlement was the internationalization of a part of the UK. That included Europe. The EU is mentioned multiple times in the Good Friday Agreement. Sometimes people like acknowledging that. Of course, the United States was a fundamental part of the whole kind of of achieving the Good Friday Agreement and the settlement both before and subsequently. And frankly, that is a problem for a lot. If you have a very sovereigntist view of the British state, you don't like the fact that this part of the, you might, when you're forced to confront it, to the extent that you really care about Northern Ireland, you might not like the fact that it's been bound up with an extraordinary subtle peace agreement and, an international organization and the United States, and it's really been swaddled in it shouldn't really be a shock that it was negotiated in the 1990s, the famous holiday from history, whenever other power blocks weren't butting heads and they were collaborating on solving quite niche problems. And that's a challenge, I think, now for people who are as sovereigntist as, for example, David Frost is. But it's also bound up, to briefly answer, it's also bound up in the question of the future of the UK and the future of the Union. And so there is famously, whenever we were moving towards the IRA, going on ceasefire, Peter Brooke, the then Northern Ireland Secretary, Jill probably will remember the famous phrase that the UK government has no selfish strategic or economic interest in Northern Ireland. That was a really critical sort of underlay of UK government policy in relation to Northern Ireland. It released the consent, it released the ability of people who were to consent in a different way to membership of the UK state, but with particular arrangements. It's not clear now that a UK minister would be able to say honestly that they do not have a selfish strategic or economic interest in Northern Ireland, because frankly, Scotland and the future of the state is more at risk. And so people are cross-referencing what's happening in Northern Ireland with what's happening in Scotland, which is, I'm afraid, a huge problem for Northern Ireland, because the whole point of the Good Friday Settlement is that it was treated as a unique and distinct jurisdiction. But there's now this kind of muscular unionism, which is kind of bash the gnats, and it's all to the good. And that, I'm afraid, is deeply destabilizing in Northern Ireland. And but it's kind of it's kind of a piece with being with not liking the Good Friday Settlement.
Matt, thank you so much. Giles, I'm not going to come to you because we're well over time, but I do want to come back to you, Jill, just for a final word. He's here all the time. It's nice to have you in. From your conversations with the EU side, what's your impression of the kind of response that we should expect from them? Do you think they are? Will tomorrow be? I don't know. In the end, do you think that they're hardening, or do you think there is room for negotiation based on what we've heard from David Frost today?
So I think if you wade your way through Michel Barnier's diaries, you'll discover the sort of interesting revelation that the Commission was very often the UK's friend, though it wasn't perceived as such, and that the harder line comes from member states. So I think what David Frost's speech today has done has made life hugely harder for Maroš Šefčovič. There's some comments that Maroš Šefčovič hasn't done what Michel Barnier did very well. If you read his book, it's basically like a sort of travelogue of, if it's Tuesday, it must be Vilnius, and if it's Thursday, it must be Bratislava. I mean, he traveled all the time to European capitals. Apparently, Maroš Šefčovič, maybe partly because of COVID reasons or whatever, isn't traveling nearly as much. And I think the real danger is that there are a lot of people, around in the EU who are heartily sick of Brexit. David Frost said, we don't want to talk about Brexit anymore. I think they really, really in the EU say, we've got loads of other issues. We've got Poland creating, we've got this, we've got that, we've got Nord Stream, we've got a million problems. We haven't got a government in Germany at the moment. The last thing we want to do is to go and rehash all this with the Brits. But the more that David Frost goes on and makes this a sort of fundamental existential battle between the UK and the EU, the harder it is to do some sort of technocratic improvements to the protocol of the sort that I think, people like Matt and Woodfield are saying, actually, you do need to make this thing, workable enough for both sides to really live with. So I think the person who's probably most exposed because of this is Maroš Šefčovič. It won't change tomorrow's proposals, but the risk is that they say, if the UK is going there anyway, why would we go any further? All they do is take it, pocket it, and then move on. So I think I think people don't expect much to happen before the COP, but I think then could potentially get really nasty, but maybe that's all wrong. Maybe it will be sweetness and light.
All right, well, let's end on that note, even though everything that came before slightly depressed me and alarmed me. But let's end on that sweetness and light. Jill, thank you so much for coming.
You're welcome.
It's really kind of you. Matthew O'Toole, Matt Dancona, thanks for your contributions as well online. Ben, sorry we didn't come back to you, but I think we've got a way of keeping in touch with you, I hope, over Utah that will mean that we can keep tabs on that story and also track the way that you get involved towards the tail end of a campaign like that.
I'd also just say really quickly that, just on the topic of the EU, that Macron has announced that he's going to use the French presidency to campaign for global abolition of the death penalty. He said that yesterday. It's all related.
I'm always astonished at the last date that France used the guillotine.
Yeah, 77.
It's just really, that's quite recent, isn't it? But but at least it worked, unlike some of the American ones. Right, thanks for coming in. Lovely to meet you, and thanks to everybody who stayed on beyond our allotted time. We will see you again tomorrow for, what are we doing tomorrow? I can't remember. Oh, forgiveness, Sharon Shoesmith and the case of Baby P. That's tomorrow at 6:30. So do join us for that. Thank you very much. See you soon. Bye.